Talking about China intrinsically raises everybody's interest. But given how many people there are talking about China these days, the ways to grab attention are either to say China is going to collapse or to say that China is taking over the world and that the renminbi is going to rule the global monetary system. I intend to be utterly boring. I'm going to land up right in the middle. My main argument is that China's currency is in fact making significant progress on its path to becoming an international currency, but it's not there yet, and it won't be for a while yet. Now, being an academic, it's useful to start by thinking about some basic concepts. And I think it's useful to separate out three distinct concepts that tend to get conflated in much of the popular discussion as well as the academic literature. One is about an international currency, and this is where a lot of the action has been so far. The fact that there is a lot of trade settlement taking place in renminbi, not just in Hong Kong, but in other trading centers as well. There are offshore deposits in renminbi. There are renminbi flowing out of China to settle those trade transactions. There are bonds, renminbi-denominated bonds being issued offshore, as well as foreign companies being allowed to issue renminbi-denominated bonds onshore. So there is a lot of action there. But there is a very distinct concept of capital account openness which is useful to keep in mind. And these two are neither necessary nor sufficient for each other. You can have a country with a very open capital account whose currency is not really used very much for international trade or financial transactions. On the other hand, as China is showing us, you can have a currency that is becoming more used internationally even without a fully open capital account. But you need both of these conditions, the use of a currency internationally as well as capital account convertibility, for a currency to become a reserve currency. But even here, China is proving to be sui generis, essentially moving along its own path. So let's break down these components. On the internationalization front, again, there has been tremendous progress. Right now, about 8 to 9% of China's trade is settled in renminbi, a lot of it through Hong Kong. Now, if you look at many of these measures, the amount of renminbi-denominated deposits offshore, the amount of trade settlement, the trajectory is very impressive. It always looks like this, because you're basically starting from zero. But nevertheless, it is quite significant, not just in terms of the amount of progress, but also the absolute amounts. But as you start digging more finely into the numbers, certain quirks start showing up. For instance, if you look at the renminbi-denominated bond issuance, a lot of it actually is by mainland companies raising funds through Hong Kong, not foreign companies. If you look at the trade settlement numbers, and these numbers were published by the authorities until a couple of quarters ago, until people started paying attention to them, it turns out that on the trade settlement, a lot of the activity is actually those on the other side of Chinese imports. In other words, when China imports goods, those on the other side, foreign exporters, are more than happy to take renminbi in payment. Why? Because essentially this is one way of making a play on the renminbi. On the other hand, if you look at Chinese exports and how much of that is being settled in renminbi, turns out to be a very small number. Foreign importers of Chinese goods either don't have the renminbi or don't want to give up the renminbi that they have. So it turns out that in fact, what many of these internationalization measures may be proxying for is in fact ways of getting around capital account restrictions, because there is still a lot of desire to go long on the renminbi. So one has to keep this perspective in mind rather than being too dazzled by the internationalization. Nevertheless, the progress is pretty significant, especially if you consider the trajectory and how fast things have been developing. On the capital account openness, there again has been fairly impressive progress. If you look at the number of restrictions that have been removed, especially on capital outflows, allowing households to take out up to $50,000 per year, which is a very significant amount for an economy that has a per capita income of somewhere in the range of $5,500 to $6,000. It looks like a completely open capital account. Likewise, corporates are being encouraged to take money out. Chinese banks are being encouraged to take money out. But here again, the critical issue is the lack of one essential aspect, which is financial market development, which is in fact going to be a running theme through my talk. If you think about households having the ability to take up to $50,000 out, that's great. But in fact, the average Chinese household finds it very difficult to get access to instruments. If you live in New York or if you live in Singapore, you can walk down to your nearest financial firm office, buy a mutual fund that gives you exposure abroad. In China, that's hard to do. So the lack of financial market development means that the capital account isn't as open as you might think based on de jure terms. But in fact, again, both in de jure and de facto terms, there is increasing openness, especially to outflows. Now here again, there is this tension between inflows and outflows, and the sense is that part of these outflows have been encouraged mainly to take the pressure off inflows, which were flooding into China until fairly recently, and which were creating pressures for the currency to appreciate. It turns out that even on the inflow side, a lot of restrictions are being removed. More foreign investors through the Qualified Foreign Institutional Investor Scheme are being encouraged to invest in China, again, as part of the financial development process. So on both of these fronts, there has been progress. Now, the reserve currency front, things have been going somewhat more slowly because, again, these two conditions have not been fully met. Now, here again, it's useful to think about what the characteristics are that are necessary for a currency to become a reserve currency. Size is very helpful. China now accounts for about 10% of world GDP in nominal exchange rates, as Professor Young showed us. If you use PPP exchange rates, that number goes up to about 15%. China now accounts for about 10% of world trade. It accounted for about 25% of world growth in purchasing power parity exchange rate terms, if you consider the crisis years 2009-10. So China is big and growing very fast. Now, size is an advantage, but it's not crucial. After all, if you think about a small economy like Switzerland, it doesn't exactly have massive size, but it does have a reserve currency. So what else matters? Good macroeconomic policies are important. Why? Because foreign investors need to have confidence that a country's currency is not going to be eroded in terms of value because of poor macroeconomic policies. These days, it's hard to say that the Western advanced economies have very good macro policies. China, by many measures, has even better macro policies in terms of inflation management and in terms of its fiscal situation. So macro policies don't seem to be a strike against China. Then there are two other issues: capital account convertibility, the ability to move money easily in and out of a country, and exchange rate flexibility. Now here again, these two concepts, an open capital account and a flexible exchange rate, are sometimes seen as synonymous. They're not. They can be very different. Hong Kong has a very open capital account, doesn't have its own exchange rate. But typically, countries that have reserve currencies tend to have an open capital account and flexible exchange rates. And China's moving slowly along this path. But that brings us to what I think is the critical determinant. The one thing that every reserve currency country has is very deep and liquid financial markets. Even Switzerland, a relatively small country in terms of size, has very deep financial markets. And this is where I think in China's case, things are moving much more slowly because the level of financial market development is limited. And here one can think about three characteristics that matter in terms of financial market development. It's breadth, having a broad array of financial instruments, government bonds, corporate bonds, and of course equities and other instruments. Depth, having a lot of those instruments, as well as liquidity, a lot of activity in those markets. Japan, for instance, is a very large bond market, a government bond market, but there isn't that much active trading. And this, in fact, is one reason why I think the US will continue to maintain its lead in terms of its reserve currency status. Why? Because the world wants relatively safe and, more importantly, liquid assets that you can convert into cash or other currencies if you need the money quickly. The dollar is widely accepted, and it's a very liquid bond market. And of course, with the inability to control the deficit and the rising level of debt, the US is happily and graciously providing to the world what it wants, which are safe and liquid assets. So this is where I think China really needs to make progress. And this, of course, gets tied in to domestic considerations. Professor Young already talked about the sequencing issue. Typically, and what history teaches us as academics, is that if you try to open up the capital account in advance of having good financial markets, in advance of having a flexible exchange rate, you can run into disaster. And in fact, the experiences of many Asian countries testify to this. In China's case, this is a potential risk, but when you're sitting on $3.3 trillion worth of foreign exchange reserves, have very little external debt, it's much less of a concern. My view, in fact, is that what China is doing is thinking about capital account openness the right way, not just as an end in itself, but as a very important approach to domestic financial market development. And this is a strategy that time and again China has used very effectively. If you think about the way they used foreign strategic investors who were allowed to take a small ownership stake in the big Chinese banks, it was because many of the big Chinese banks had been given an opportunity to improve their corporate governance. They didn't. So foreign strategic investors were brought in as a way of moving this process along. Again, as we've learned that bringing in foreign strategic investors from the West may not have been the ideal place to look for good corporate governance or good financial market governance, but still in a relative sense, it may have been a good place to look. So in that sense, I think China is very wisely using capital account liberalization, and in some of my research, I've referred to this as the collateral benefit of financial opening. China doesn't need more money. It's got an enormous amount of savings. What it needs is a financial system that can more effectively intermediate both domestic and foreign savings in a better way, that gives households better returns on their savings, and that allocates more capital in a more productive way that increases the productive efficiency of the economy. And foreign investors can help build financial institutions, can help in both of these dimensions that I talked about, breadth, depth, and also the third dimension, liquidity. So there are still some risks perhaps in moving too fast on capital account opening, but I think in fact this way that China is approaching this is in fact tactically a very good approach in terms of meeting its domestic objectives. So what do I think will happen to China's reserve currency status? In fact, and here again this is remarkable, China's currency, even though it's not convertible, even though it cannot be counted as a reserve currency, is actually gaining reserve currency status to some extent. Right now, there are 4 central banks that have already indicated they're holding or are going to hold foreign exchange reserves in renminbi. There is Chile, Nigeria, Malaysia. Japan has now signed a bilateral currency pact and intends to hold Chinese government bonds as part of its FX reserve portfolio. And Korea has indicated its intention very recently. Now, this is an interesting issue. Why on earth would countries start thinking about holding reserves in renminbi? Again, it's because China's size and China's increasing trade linkages mean that everybody wants to be China's friend. But more importantly, it's not what the IMF thinks about what are reserves, because central banks hold reserves not because they want to please the IMF, but because they want to deter pressure from international investors on their currency. And if markets are willing to say, it doesn't matter to us whether you hold dollars or renminbi, if you hold a lot, and to evoke a famous line from the former US Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson, if you want to scare off people, you don't want a gun in your pocket, you want a big bazooka, lots of reserves. And if some of those reserves have a little red tinge on them, a little communist tinge of renminbi, it doesn't matter. It's what the markets believe that really matters. Moreover, 17 central banks, and more are coming down the line, have signed currency swap lines with China. Now, the People's Bank of China did have currency swap lines with central banks even a decade ago. One crucial difference, those were in dollars. The 17 central banks that now have swap lines all have local currency swap lines. In other words, foreign central banks are saying we are happy to have access to a renminbi credit line in case things turn bad. Now, the amounts are pretty small so far. So, for instance, just this year, the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, and Australia, all three central banks have signed bilateral swap lines with the People's Bank of China. The amount of the Australian central bank's swap line was the biggest of the lot, just $32 billion, not a huge amount. But I've spoken to some of these central bank governors, and the uniform response one hears from them when asked, these amounts are small, why do you bother? Is that they say China is becoming big, the renminbi is going to become a major reserve currency, so we want to set up this relationship with China so that we can expand these lines. Right now, China is open to all takers. It may be more selective in the future. So everybody wants to ride the China bandwagon. So my sense is that the currency is on its way, but financial market development, again, being the critical characteristic, I think it's going to take a while. So my sense is that over the next 10 years or so, the capital account is going to become a lot more open, and in addition, we're going to have the Chinese currency become an important reserve currency, eroding, but almost certainly not displacing the dollar's dominance. But other interesting things are happening in the medium term. My other prediction is that over the next 5 years, the renminbi will become a part of the IMF's basket of special drawing rights. Is this because China needs the IMF? Hardly. It's more that the IMF needs China, because having China become and its currency become part of the SDR basket essentially might be seen as a way of trying to get China to pay more heed to its international obligations. So perhaps this can be used as a device to bring China into the fold, so to speak. So I think the process is going to be very interesting. The end result, I have no doubt, is going to be that the currency is going to become an important player in global financial markets. Whether it becomes a dominant player, I think, is something that is going to depend on how China handles its own reform process. But what we are seeing here, as in many other cases, is China striking out on its own path in a very interesting way. It's what I call capital account liberalization with Chinese characteristics. Thank you.